Jade City, Book 1 of the Greenbone Saga by Fonda. Jade City is a gripping Godfather-esque saga of intergenerational blood feuds, vicious politics, magic, and kung fu. The Koala family is one of 2 crime syndicates that control the island of Koala. It's the only place in the world that produces rare, magical jade, which grants those with the right training and heritage superhuman abilities. The Greenbone clans of honourable jade-wearing warriors once protected the island from foreign invasion, but nowadays, in a bustling post-war metropolis full of fast cars and foreign money, Greenbone families like the Koals are primarily involved in commerce, construction, and the everyday upkeep of the districts under their protection. When the simmering tension between the Koals and their greatest rivals erupts into open violence in the streets, the outcome of this clan war will determine the fate of all Greenbones and the future of Koala itself. There will be spoilers for chapters 1 to 31 only. I wanted to do this review before my book club discussion on Sunday in case someone in the chat manages to change my mind about how I feel about this book. I've read all of the book, but as mentioned, I'll only be discussing chapters 1 to 31. There are 3 aspects of the book that I do not like. One of them relates to characters, one of them relates to the prose and the writing of the book, and the other one relates to world building and scene setting. First, in relation to the characters, they are all thoroughly unlikable. All of the main characters essentially turn a blind eye to the predatory behaviour on the part of the character of Doru, the weatherman. It's not clear whether he's a pedophile, but he is certainly a sexual predator who preys upon people who do not have as much power as he does. I was particularly disgusted that Shay did not stick up for her friend. This is the passage from the book. Unlike her brothers, Shay had not had a lot of friends at Koala Academy. Of the other female students, the one she was closest to was one Paya Deshan, the talented but shy daughter of a middling lantern man. Paya's mother had died from illness some years ago, and Shay often brought her friend over to the Koala house. One day, Shay was searching for something. She could not even remember what, when she stumbled upon a manila envelope full of photographs in Doru's desk. Pretty Paya in her underwear, Paya on her hands and knees wearing a dog collar, Paya naked, legs spread, pale and awkward looking, eyes moist. Her friend had cried in shame and abject relief when Shay told her to never come back to the house. She begged Shay to understand. She wasn't that kind of girl. She'd never wanted to do it. But Doru Jen was being so good to her father's business. What could she have said or done? Shay told her grandfather that she would not be tutored by Doru any more. She'd learn whatever else she needed to about the clan business from the senior luck-bringers, such as Hami Tumashon, but she would not have anything more to do with the weatherman. Be reasonable, Shay said, Coulson had said. Every man has weaknesses. You don't know what they did to Doru Jen during the war. He has never treated you with any disrespect. Years away had not dimmed Shay's loathing of Yon Dorupon. He'd cost her not just a friend, but the once matchless admiration she'd had for her grandfather. Then in another chapter, Shay and her brothers are discussing Doru. Shay hesitated to answer. As repulsive as she found Doru, she had to agree with Lan that it was difficult to imagine the veteran weatherman ever undermining the clan. When it came to war and business, her grandfather had trusted him absolutely for decades. How could the Torch himself have been such a poor judge of character? I don't know, Shay said, but he has to go. If he's not a traitor, then he's a negligent weatherman. I have a feeling that we are supposed to applaud the siblings at that point, that they're finally getting rid of Doru, but the reason they're getting rid of him is because he's a traitor or a negligent weatherman. They don't seem to care that he is the Harvey Weinstein of the clan and that he is potentially a rapist. I think what bothers me is that over the years, none of them have actually done anything to address his behaviour. Even though they themselves did not engage in disgusting conduct like he did, they have essentially turned a blind eye. And I know that it could be argued that they do not have the same power, but I'm not sure that that's an excuse. I find it very weird that his behaviour is essentially hand-waved away. Aside from the fact that none of the main characters are likable, I think I would have enjoyed it more if the characters were a little more nuanced. Instead, they are all caricatures or tropey stereotypes. Hilo possibly has the most nuance of the siblings. He's essentially the muscle with the heart of gold. But I've seen that type portrayed much better. For instance, Amos Burton from The Expanse, Severo from Red Rising, and Wayne from Mistborn Era 2. I know we're supposed to like him, but there is a squicky chapter in which he goes into Wen's house and pretends to be a creeper. We'll get to that in a moment. Next is the character of Shay. I think she's supposed to be the character with which we identify the most. Unfortunately, I found that she was just a really whiny version of Michael Corleone from The Godfather. She wants to leave the family business, she tries to deny the family business, then she comes back to the family and isn't really any better than anybody else. I found her very disappointing given that she's the only female lead character apart from possibly Wen. I tend to focus more on female characters when I read books, and I found her very bland and uninspiring. I found it very disappointing that from a female author, the women in the books are only there to be alluring, pathetic, and sexual, and Shay is herself quite bland. I don't mind shades of complexity and grey in my characters, so it's not that I wanted her to be, Pollyanna and perfect. For instance, I love the characters from The Expanse. Clarissa and Avasarala are my favourite female characters in The Expanse, and they've certainly got a lot of grey. Finally, of the three siblings, there is Lan. He is the most thoughtful and cerebral of the three, but he's kind of a sulky, sooky whiner and not particularly compelling and intriguing. I'm not sure whether we're supposed to like him, but there's not enough depth to the character for me to particularly admire or want to read more about him. The fourth character, who's not really a main character yet, is Andon, and I thought he was okay, but like I said, he's not one of the main characters, but maybe out of the whole cast, he's probably the only one that I thought was semi-decent. In relation to the characterization of women in this novel, the first female character that shows up is really just there for sex. That's Wen. We don't know anything more about her before that. I've read smutty romance before, but this was really weird. It was a mutated version of new adult sex. The chapter was also called The Horns Kitten, which I also found kind of gross. And this is the bit which I found kind of gross. Hilo comes in through the window of Wen's house and sees her sleeping on the bed. Okay, so this is from the book. Hilo switched off the light, plunging the room into darkness. Then he climbed on top of her, pinning her body and covering her mouth with his hand. She came awake in a start. Her eyes flew open as her body jerked under his weight. She let out a muffled scream before he laughed softly and whispered into her ear, "You should be more careful, Wen. If you leave the window open at night, men with bad intentions might come through it." So after that rather rapey introduction, they then proceed to have sex. Suffice to say, I did not find their relationship very compelling or appealing. So in relation to the characters, I am shocked that even Red Rising, which I hated when I started it, had characters and character moments that I ended up really liking. Victor and Ragnar, even though I didn't really like the characters that I was supposed to like Darrow and Mustang. There were points in this book when I swear I would not have minded if every single character had died. And this is from someone who actually gets devastated when book characters that I like die. I found that the characters spent just a lot of time whinging and being sooky misery guts and just not very interesting to read about. The second aspect is the prose and the writing. It wasn't terrible writing, but it wasn't very compelling. So even though it wasn't a standout, I don't have anything in particular to critique, except that, as I've mentioned, the sex scenes were written in an eye-rollingly new adult romance style, very perfunctory, not particularly compelling. And they definitely took me out of the vibe of the book. Finally, The aspect that everybody raves about, because this book is almost universally lauded by everybody on the internet. I already know before going into my book club discussion on Sunday that every single other person in the club loved the book, thinks it's fantastic. I am in a very small minority of people that did not like this book. But one of the things that people like the most about it is the fact that it is a fantasy novel set in Asia rather than in Europe. They talk about the world building and the scene setting. For me personally, I think it's okay. And it's kind of good to see a fantasy novel that isn't necessarily set in the West. But I think it leans too heavily into Orientalism tropes. And I don't find the lack of nuance in the writing fun. So there's a lot of Asian tropes and stereotypes, probably for the white gaze, patriarchy, hierarchy, Confucian ideals, racism, ethnocentric behaviour, xenophobia, clannishness, sexism, classism, being superstitious. The author tries to have a little bit more complexity by introducing politics and machinations, but ultimately it's just many scenes of individual instances of violence or massive groups of clan and gang violence in which they kill the crap out of one another. You know, all these Asian people, they're so brutal, they're barbaric and uncivilized. It's not that dissimilar to, you know, the many fight sequences that you might see in John Wick 4 or The Matrix. I personally feel like the Hong Kong film Infernal Affairs was far more nuanced and did it better. And, you know, ultimately I'm not really a fan of media about gangs, triad, Tong, mafia, Yazuka, Irish mob. It's weird that this book came along just as I was reading another novel called The Night Raven, in which the gangs in particular are magical families. But I really felt like it was a very run-of-the-mill gangster Asian mafia succession dominance storyline that had Orientalism and fantasy elements thrown in to make it different. But ultimately, it still felt a little bit tired and tropey and a little bit cliched. And this is coming from someone who actually likes wire fu movies and, you know, some of those cheesy kung fu dramas. I felt like this was a very disappointing novel. So that's how I felt coming up to the end of chapter 31. And I will be very interested to see whether or not I change my mind by the time I've finished the book chapter.